Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolute unit that was Homo neanderthalensis, the brawny, brainy, misunderstood cousins of ours who didn't just survive the Ice Age, they bench-pressed it. From their freakish strength to their surprising culture, Neanderthals weren't just cavemen, they were nature's gym rats with a flair for interior decorating. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you walked into Ice Age Europe around 80,000 years ago, you'd probably freeze solid within 30 seconds. But before that happened, you might catch a glimpse of a Neanderthal, the local apex hominin, and possibly the only creature on Earth who looked like they could beat a mammoth in a wrestling match. Neanderthals weren't just different from modern humans, they were optimized for punishment. Imagine a person designed by a committee of bodybuilders, Arctic engineers, and someone who really liked forehead real estate. That's a Neanderthal. Let's start with the body. Neanderthals were shorter than us on average, around 5'4" to 5'6". But calling them short is misleading. They weren't small. They were condensed. Stocky frames, huge rib cages, broad shoulders, and a build so sturdy it looked like their skeletons had been reinforced for demolition work. Their bones were thick, dense, and frankly overqualified for anything less than full-contact mammoth takedowns. Their limbs were short and powerful, which helped conserve heat in brutally cold climates. Their hands were massive, with strong thumbs, perfect for crafting tools, grabbing prey, or, presumably, opening pickle jars that modern humans wouldn't even attempt. And then there's the face. Neanderthals didn't look weird. We look weird. Their skulls were long and low, with prominent brow ridges that could have doubled as ski jumps. Their noses were large and forward-facing, possibly as a built-in heater for that frosty Ice Age air. Their jaws were powerful, their chins basically non-existent, and their expressions likely somewhere between mildly confused and always ready for a fight. But make no mistake, these weren't brutish thugs. This wasn't a failed prototype of humanity. This was a parallel success story. They were tailored, top to bottom, for their environment, and in that environment, they thrived. Neanderthals were the elite endurance athletes of their day. If that day involved ice storms, cave bears, and hunting dinner with a sharpened stick, every inch of them said, "Yes, I've broken several ribs. No, I don't regret it." If you've ever felt proud of your bone density after lifting a milk jug without hurting yourself, sit down. Neanderthals were walking fortresses. Their skeletons weren't just sturdy, they were medieval architecture sturdy. We're talking bones so thick they make modern human femurs look like discount chopsticks. Let's start with their legs. Neanderthal femurs were short and incredibly robust, designed not for running marathons, but for powering through rough, mountainous terrain, while carrying roughly half a reindeer on one shoulder. Their knees were shaped to handle constant bending and squatting, which is useful when you spend most of your day building fires, shaping stone tools, or elbow-deep in large animal carcasses. Their arms, equally terrifying. Their upper arm bones were massively thick, and their forearms even thicker, a unique trait among hominins. This wasn't just for show. They weren't flexing on Instagram. They were literally built to wield heavy tools and haul enormous prey across rocky tundra. If modern humans are built like Swiss Army knives, Neanderthals were jackhammers with eyebrows. Even their rib cages told a story. Modern humans have a more barrel-shaped rib cage, tapering toward the waist. Neanderthals, however, had wide, flaring rib cages that gave them room for huge lungs, likely necessary to survive the cold, oxygen-thin air of glacial Europe. Basically, their respiratory system was the equivalent of industrial bellows. More oxygen in, more mammoth-chasing energy out. And let's not forget the skull. Not just the brow ridges, although those were magnificent. Their skulls were longer, flatter and thicker, with larger areas for muscle attachment. That meant powerful jaws and neck muscles. They could probably chew frozen venison without blinking. Interestingly, this reinforced skeleton came with a cost. They likely matured faster than us and may have had slightly shorter lifespans. But while they were around, they packed a lifetime of bruises, breaks, and brutal living into every year. Their bones show constant wear, healed fractures, joint damage, and blunt force trauma. Like they were auditioning for a prehistoric action film. Let's address the big, brainy elephant in the room. Neanderthals had huge brains. Not metaphorically, literally. Their brains were bigger than ours, about 1,500 to 1,150 cubic centimeters, compared to our modern average of 1,150. That's right, the so-called brute cavemen were walking around with high-performance cranial engines. And they didn't even have spreadsheets to suffer through. But before you crown them honorary professors, a disclaimer. Bigger doesn't automatically mean smarter. A blue whale has a massive brain and has yet to invent indoor plumbing. That said, Neanderthals weren't just carrying around cranial ballast. They used it. A large portion of their brain volume went toward sensory processing and motor skills, especially vision and movement coordination. That makes sense when your daily schedule includes stalking elk in a snowstorm and not accidentally walking off a cliff. They needed to navigate dangerous terrain, track animals over long distances, and work with tools, all without the aid of Google Maps or opposable thumbs that scrolled Instagram. Their visual cortex was particularly large, likely giving them incredible eyesight. Picture sharp-eyed, frost-covered Neanderthals squinting dramatically into the blizzard like Ice Age anime characters, but with more fur and fewer monologues. And while their prefrontal cortex, the "let's think before we do this" part, might have been proportionally smaller than ours, evidence shows they weren't just acting on impulse. Their lives required planning, cooperation, and a surprising amount of creativity, including the kind that involves painting cave walls and possibly applying ochre like early makeup. So yes, your ancient Neanderthal aunt may have invented contouring long before TikTok did. Neanderthals also adapted impressively across Europe and parts of Asia, from dry steppe to icy tundra, which required some serious cognitive flexibility. They learned to use local resources, build shelter, make tools, and occasionally invent a new way to hurt themselves with flint. Still not impressed? Try this. We once thought all their tools and art were stolen ideas from early modern humans. Then we found Neanderthal art and ornaments older than anything Homo sapiens had done in the region. Turns out we were just late to the cave party. If nature had a survive the worst conditions imaginable design contest, Neanderthals would have walked away with the prize. And probably the trophy too, just to use it as a hammer. These hominins weren't just adapted to the Ice Age. They were engineered for it. Picture the kind of weather that makes your nose hairs freeze, and now imagine living in that without heated floors, hoodies, or any concept of hot cocoa. That's Neanderthal territory. Their bodies were short and stocky, not by accident, but by design. This compact shape helped them conserve body heat, which is exactly what you want when your environment looks like the freezer aisle of a cursed grocery store. Long, lanky limbs lose heat faster. Neanderthals had limbs so thick and short, penguins would have nodded in approval. Their noses were massive, and no, not for sniffing out gossip. Their large nasal cavities helped warm and humidify frigid air before it reached their lungs. It was nature's version of an HVAC system, built directly into their faces. A useful adaptation, and a great excuse for having a face you could rest a brick on. Even their skin likely contributed to their icy resilience. While we can't know exact pigmentation, most scientists agree they probably had lighter skin tones to better synthesize vitamin D in low light conditions. Because if you're going to survive 6 months of perpetual gloom, you'd better be able to wring sunshine out of a grey sky. Their lungs were likely enormous, needed to fuel bodies that were doing manual labour 24/7, climbing, hunting, hauling, carving, and occasionally inventing new ways to pull a muscle. That wide barrel chest wasn't for show. It was a prehistoric furnace. Clothing? Oh yes. They weren't running around in fur loincloths unless they were into that. Evidence suggests Neanderthals wore stitched hides to insulate themselves from the cold. And stitching isn't simple. It means they planned ahead, created tools, and probably had some version of winter wear and slightly less winter wear. In short, Neanderthals weren't barely surviving the Ice Age. They were thriving in it. They weren't nature's underdogs. They were nature's snowplows, designed to march through the cold, grunting softly, and wondering why the mammoths were always so dramatic about it. When you think of Neanderthal fashion, you probably imagine a single fur draped over one shoulder, maybe held on by a piece of vine, accessorized with a club and a general lack of self-awareness. But real Neanderthal clothing? Surprisingly sophisticated. Primitive, sure, but with more function than flair, and just enough chaos to make a medieval tailor weep. Let's be clear, Ice Age Europe wasn't a great place to experiment with fashion minimalism. If you went outside in winter wearing just optimism and vibes, you'd freeze solid before you could say, saber-toothed mistake. So Neanderthals got clever. Evidence suggests they didn't just wrap themselves in animal skins like discarded couch covers. They processed hides, softened them, and stitched them together, using bone needles. That's right. They were hand-sewing outfits out of deer and mammoth, before buttons were even a concept. And they didn't even complain on Reddit. And let's talk about accessories. Some Neanderthal sites contain eagle talons, pierced shells, and beads. These weren't strictly functional, which implies they liked a little flair, maybe a dash of symbolism, maybe even some Ice Age swagger. Imagine a Neanderthal walking into camp like, yes, this claw necklace is real. Yes, I caught the bird myself. No, you may not touch it. They also used ochre, a naturally occurring red pigment, on their tools, bodies, and possibly even faces. Was it war paint? Decoration? Some kind of social signal? No one knows for sure. But it does mean at some point, a Neanderthal looked at a red rock and said, "This would look incredible on my cheekbones." Now, were they ready for Fashion Week? Not unless the runway was covered in snow lit by firelight and followed by an intense hunt. But their clothing did what it needed to. It kept them warm, dryish, and protected from both the weather and judgmental Homo sapiens. Let's also not overlook the practical brilliance. Every outfit was biodegradable, locally sourced, and cruelty-based. Because, well, hunting. That's sustainable Ice Age fashion. Neanderthals weren't just strong. They were punch a woolly rhino in the face strong. The kind of strength that makes you question whether physics was working differently back then, or if they were just born with a natural gym membership to the universe. Everything about their anatomy screams power. Their muscle mass was enormous, especially in the shoulders, arms, and legs, areas needed for daily tasks like hurling spears, skinning animals, hauling carcasses, and occasionally moving boulders for fun. Their bone structure, as we've discussed, could support a small siege engine, which means those muscles weren't for show. They were functional gains. But how strong were they really? Estimates suggest a Neanderthal male could be up to 50% stronger than a modern human of the same size, and in terms of upper body strength, possibly even double. This isn't farm strong or dad strong. This is accidentally rip the door off your cave strong. They didn't just hunt from a distance with carefully thrown projectiles. No, Neanderthals preferred the close contact approach. They'd run up to large, angry Ice Age megafauna and jab them with spears at near point-blank range. Their version of dinner prep involved dodging tusks while keeping a firm grip on something that wanted them dead. And the wear and tear? Oh, it shows. Their fossil records are full of healed injuries. Broken arms, crushed ribs, damaged skulls. All signs that they weren't just strong, but resilient. If a Neanderthal broke something, they either walked it off or wrapped it in moss and hoped for the best. Then they went right back to hunting. Even their grip strength was absurd. Some researchers believe they could crush modern humans' hands without trying. Their thumbs were larger, their fingers broader, and their knuckles capable of damage usually reserved for medieval weapons. If you're picturing the Rock, but fuzzier and more likely to throw a stone axe at you, you're not far off. If there's one thing Neanderthal fossils consistently tell us, it's that these people lived hard. Not forgot to wear sunscreen hard. More like tackled a raging bison before lunch hard. Their skeletons read less like quiet prehistoric memoirs and more like accident reports from an Ice Age rodeo. Seriously, when paleoanthropologists looked at the trauma patterns in Neanderthal remains, they noticed something oddly familiar. The types of injuries, fractured ribs, broken arms, crushed faces, were strikingly similar to those found in professional rodeo riders. And no, that is not a joke. Apparently, if you regularly tangle with one-ton mammals for a living, your bones tell a very specific kind of story. Take Shanidar 1, for example. This poor guy had a blow to the head that crushed part of his skull, probably left him partially blind, and also had a withered right arm, likely from a healed break. His foot was damaged too. Basically, he was the human equivalent of a walking before photo in an orthopedic ad. And yet, he survived for years after those injuries. That means other Neanderthals were taking care of him. Because apparently, even if you're a tank of a man with one working eye and a limp, your Ice Age buddies still make room for you at the fire. Another famous case, La Chapelle au Sein, an older male with severe arthritis, missing teeth and spinal issues. And again, he was clearly cared for. So not only were Neanderthals getting injured in ways that would terrify modern OSHA inspectors, but they were also helping each other heal. Emotional support and survival. Neanderthals said, yes, we do both. But the frequency of these injuries also tells us about their lifestyles. These weren't people who hunted small game from a distance or foraged daintily. They got up close and personal with danger. Their weapons were mostly thrusting spears. Think stab rather than throw. And when you hunt like that, the animal usually fights back. The next time you trip on a rug and feel sorry for yourself, remember, Neanderthals spent their lives getting tackled by Ice Age death machines, shrugged it off with some moss and fire, and still lived long enough to invent personal grooming. Now that's resilience. Neanderthals didn't just survive the Ice Age, they brought fire to it, which is basically the prehistoric version of telling winter, not today, Satan. Now, they weren't out there throwing fireballs or inventing s'mores, but they absolutely knew how to make, maintain, and weaponize fire in ways that would have made a caveman version of Bear Grylls nod approvingly. How do we know this? Archaeological sites reveal clear evidence of hearths, centralized fire pits with charred bones, heated stones, and layers of ash, sometimes built up over years in the same spot. That's not just a random wildfire. That's a Neanderthal choosing a nice location, building a fire, and then cooking dinner next to it while probably glaring at the wind. The prevailing theory is that they used methods like striking flint against pyrite, creating a spark that could ignite dry grass or moss. No matches, no lighters, no YouTube tutorials, just raw determination and a suspicious pile of rocks. The Ice Age version of hold my beer. They didn't just use fire for warmth either. Fire helped them cook food, which made it easier to chew and digest. This wasn't just a culinary improvement, it also unlocked more nutrients, reduced parasites, and possibly gave them more time to invent other helpful things, like gossip. Then there's the tool-making advantage. Heating flint can make it easier to nap or shape into tools, so it's possible Neanderthals were practicing thermal engineering before humans even figured out how to invent pointless committees. And let's not forget about defense. Fire scares predators. Sitting around a fire meant not only warmth and light, but a makeshift force field against anything that growled in the dark. Picture a bunch of Neanderthals roasting meat, telling stories, and casting intimidating shadows on the cave walls. Fire was their home security system. Were they the first to discover fire? Probably not. But they mastered it in their own steady, practical, and impressively chill way. They didn't flaunt it. They just quietly turned cold caves into livable homes and meat into slightly less chewy meat. Neanderthals didn't have multi-tools, screwdrivers, or YouTube how-tos, but give them a chunk of flint and a moment of silence, and they'd whip up a toolkit that could skin a deer, build a shelter, and possibly open a medieval wine bottle. Their tools weren't just sharp rocks, they were strategically crafted instruments made with attention to detail, purpose, and just the right amount of controlled violence. The primary technique they used? The Levallois method, a complicated multi-step process involving preparing a stone core in such a way that flakes could be removed in a predictable shape. In other words, they weren't just banging rocks together like toddlers. They were planning ahead, shaping cores, analysing angles, and executing cuts with such finesse that modern archaeologists sometimes mistake their work for early Homo sapiens craftsmanship, which frankly must be annoying for them. Among the Neanderthal tool repertoire were scrapers, points, awls, borers, and even hafted tools, blades attached to wooden shafts using tree resin and sinew. That's not just make-sharp thing. That's prehistoric composite engineering, which is a fancy way of saying duct tape, but way harder to invent. They used these tools for everything: butchering meat, tanning hides, woodworking, and probably the occasional angry gesture. And let's be real, anyone who can figure out how to glue stone to stick using tree goo and patience deserves a TED Talk. Their toolkits varied by region too. This means Neanderthals weren't just copying one another, they were innovating, adapting their methods to local resources, climates, and prey. One group might use limestone, another flint. Some even seem to have experimented with bone and antler tools. It's like prehistoric Etsy. And they weren't afraid of improvement. Over time, their tools got more refined, more efficient, and arguably more deadly. This wasn't evolution doing the work. This was brains and practice. When most people picture Neanderthals, they imagine grunting figures hunched around a fire, club in one hand, dinner still twitching in the other. But the archaeological record tells a different story. One where the same people who could dismember a reindeer in 5 minutes also paused to decorate a shell or bury a loved one with flowers. Yes, Neanderthals had culture, and not just the kind that grows on old meat. Let's start with burials. Multiple Neanderthal sites show evidence of intentional graves, often in shallow pits, sometimes with grave goods or traces of pollen, suggesting flowers may have been placed with the dead. Whether this was spiritual, symbolic, or just a prehistoric version of "he liked plants," we may never know. But the point is, they cared. They mourned. They didn't just toss grandma behind a boulder and call it a day. And then there's art. For years, it was assumed Neanderthals didn't do art. That was supposed to be our thing. Then we found cave paintings in Spain, made with red ochre over 64,000 years ago. Spoiler. That's before modern humans showed up in Europe. That awkward silence you hear is anthropology professors re-evaluating everything they once said with confidence. Neanderthals also collected decorative objects, pierced shells, feathers, eagle talons, things that served no obvious practical function unless they were secretly inventing cosplay. Some may have been used as ornaments, ritual objects, or social signals. Either way, they weren't just about surviving, they were about meaning. There's even a mysterious cave structure found in France, deep underground, made from broken stalagmites arranged into rings. No sunlight, no apparent use, no graffiti, just Neanderthals, 176,000 years ago, building in the dark like they were summoning something. Or maybe just being weird. Who knows? And we can't forget language. They had the hyoid bone, crucial for speech, and genes related to language processing. So they may not have written poetry, but it's safe to say they weren't just grunting. Somewhere, a Neanderthal once looked at another and said something meaningful. Probably about meat, but still, meaningful. Let's talk about what you're really curious about. Yes, Neanderthals and modern humans. got together, romantically, biblically, DNA testably. When early Homo sapiens migrated into Europe and Asia around 60,000 years ago, they ran into the locals, the Neanderthals, and rather than treating them like distant cousins at a wedding, they did the evolutionary equivalent of asking, "You up?" with zero irony. We know this happened because it's written in our genes, literally. Most people of non-African descent today carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, which means somewhere in your ancestry, one of your very, very, very great-grandparents had an Ice Age date night that got out of hand. Was it love? Survival strategy? A prehistoric version of, well, the gene pool's not that big. Scientists are still debating. Some encounters were probably consensual, others less so. It's hard to say for certain what prehistoric romance looked like, but we do know it left genetic fingerprints that still linger in things like immune system traits, skin tone, and possibly your tendency to dislike cilantro. Also interesting, this wasn't just a one-time fluke. Genetic evidence shows that interbreeding happened multiple times, in different places, over thousands of years. So clearly, it wasn't just one confused Homo sapiens at a very dark cave party. And it wasn't all in one direction. Neanderthal males and Homo sapiens females seemed to mix more frequently, possibly due to the sheer charisma of early human travel stories and slightly better cheekbones. Though we'll never know if the Neanderthals were more impressed by conversation skills or fire-starting ability. What we do know is that this mixing didn't result in a blended superspecies. The Neanderthals eventually disappeared, but parts of them live on in us. Your slightly wide nose? That could be a Neanderthal gift. Your love of red meat and aversion to cardio? Also suspicious. Before you laugh at Neanderthals for their giant brows or suspicious fashion choices, you should probably check your ancestry report, because statistically speaking, you might be part Neanderthal. No offence, it's science. Thanks to genome sequencing and the tireless efforts of geneticists with high-powered microscopes and too much coffee, we now know that most people of non-African descent carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. That means if you're watching this and your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparent wore fur and didn't blink during snowstorms, congratulations, you're a little bit Ice Age, and this ancient inheritance isn't just a quirky footnote, it shows up in real ways. For starters, Neanderthal genes have been linked to traits involving skin tone, hair texture, immune response, and even pain sensitivity. So if you sunburn easily, react strangely to allergens, or stub your toe and feel like you've been shot, you may have the Neanderthal edition of human firmware. There's even evidence that Neanderthal DNA affects how people sleep, process fat, and respond to certain medications. Some studies suggest it may influence mood regulation, meaning, yes, your brooding tendencies and general grumpiness in winter may be genetically justified, but it's not all good news. Some Neanderthal gene variants have also been linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, depression, and nicotine addiction. So while your ancient cousins might have helped you survive a woolly mammoth ambush, they might also be partly responsible for your impulse to buy snacks and doomscroll at 2 a.m. It's also worth noting that African populations, whose ancestors didn't interbreed with Neanderthals after migrating out of Africa, have little to no Neanderthal DNA. But they do have traces of other archaic humans, like the Denisovans, meaning the human family tree is less of a clean chart and more of a tangled, romantically chaotic shrub. Neanderthals thrived for nearly 300,000 years, surviving ice ages, saber-toothed predators, and each other. They were the original Europeans, the true locals. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Quietly. No dramatic extinction event. No comet. Just fade to black. Like they missed the memo about sticking around for the Holocene. So what happened? One theory is climate change. As the last ice age began shifting, Neanderthals struggled to adapt to new environments. Their hunting grounds changed, large game became scarce, and even mammoths started acting dramatic. For a group built to dominate the cold, warming weather was less summer vibes and more existential crisis. Another theory, competition with Homo sapiens. When modern humans arrived in Europe, they brought things like long-distance weapons, more varied diets, and that extremely annoying habit of surviving everywhere. They reproduced faster, travelled farther, and possibly talked more, which in a species contest counts for a lot. It's also likely that Neanderthals were outnumbered. Their populations were smaller and more isolated, meaning less genetic diversity. A serious problem when every winter is a survival game show and your neighbours are reproducing like it's a competitive sport. And yet, this wasn't a violent takeover. There's no massive evidence of genocide or battles. If anything, Neanderthals and humans coexisted for thousands of years, traded DNA, shared ideas, and probably some awkward campfire conversations, and slowly blended until there weren't any pure Neanderthal populations left. The last known Neanderthals likely lived in southern Iberia, places like Gibraltar, where they held on for a few thousand years more like the final flickers of a candle. The archaeological record goes quiet. No new tools, no new burials, just stillness. But this wasn't a failure. It was a chapter, and one that left a permanent mark. Neanderthals didn't go out with a bang, but their influence lives on. Not in monuments or scrolls, but in DNA, in bones, in blood. They weren't erased, they were absorbed. For most of modern history, Neanderthals got the short end of the evolutionary stick. Not in terms of biology, but in public relations. They were the original victims of bad press. When the first Neanderthal fossils were discovered in the mid-1800s, scientists weren't sure what to make of them. The skull looked humanish, but the brow ridges were huge, and the limbs were weirdly thick, like someone had taken a normal person and run them through a bulk filter. Victorian scientists, being Victorian scientists, quickly labelled them brutish, primitive, and likely terrible at dinner conversation. Thus began the myth of the stooped, grunting caveman, part monster, part embarrassing uncle. And the name Neanderthal itself didn't help. It sounded harsh, like something that might live under a bridge and throw stones at goats. Early reconstructions didn't do them any favours either. One famous depiction showed a Neanderthal standing like a gorilla, with a 1,000-yard stare and no neck, which, spoiler, was based on an elderly individual with arthritis. That would be like judging all humans based on someone's great-grandpa during a back spasm. The image stuck. Cartoons, movies, and textbooks reinforced the stereotype. A dumb brute with a club and questionable posture. Meanwhile, the truth, that Neanderthals buried their dead, created art, made tools, and possibly wore jewellery, was quietly ignored in favour of grunts and loincloths. Why did we do this? Probably because it made us feel superior. Humans love a good story about how we were the chosen ones, the smart ones, the only ones. Reducing Neanderthals to failed prototypes let us keep that narrative intact. It also helped explain away any uncomfortable genetic overlap. Sure, we're related, but we're better, right? Only recently has the myth begun to unravel. As more archaeological discoveries emerge, we're forced to admit that Neanderthals were more like us than not. They weren't mistakes. They were a parallel success. Different strategies, same struggle. In the war-torn twilight of Japan's Heian period, the battlefield was no place for a woman, and yet that's precisely where Tomo Gozen belonged. Imagine a sea of armoured men clashing steel in the dust and chaos of war, and among them, one lone figure stands out. Not because she was out of place, but because she was more skilled, more fearless, and more precise than most of the warriors around her. Tomo Gozen wasn't just some camp follower or noble lady playing at war. She was a trained warrior, Onamusha, from the province of Echigo. From a young age, she was taught to ride, to shoot a bow from horseback, and to wield a katana with such ferocity that she left men twice her size bleeding in the dirt. Her loyalty lay with Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a prominent general of the Minamoto clan. But make no mistake, Tomoe wasn't merely his bodyguard or ornament. She was his commander, his equal, his enforcer. Contemporary accounts describe her as a remarkably beautiful woman, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the compliments didn't stop at her looks. They spoke of her strength, her uncanny skill in archery, and her unmatched swordsmanship. And this wasn't poetry or court gossip. It was battlefield fact. She could break through ranks, decapitate a foe mid-gallop, and keep riding without so much as a misstep. Tomoe Gozen was a storm in human form, and the timing of her rise was no coincidence. Japan was being torn apart in the Genpei War, a civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans for control of the imperial throne. Feudal codes were being rewritten. The samurai class was rising. And in this vacuum of order and chaos, Tomoe Gozen carved out a space no woman had ever dared claim before, on the front lines. She didn't just fight. She commanded troops. She won duels. She carried heads back to camp, like any warrior proving their kill. And most of all, she defied the carefully drawn lines of what womanhood was supposed to look like in 12th century Japan. Tomoe Gozen wasn't an exception. She was a revelation, a warning, and a legend in the making. Before Tomoe Gozen ever tasted battle, she had to master survival in a world built to exclude her. Feudal Japan was steeped in hierarchy, honor, and hard lines, especially for women. Daughters of samurai were expected to be polite, loyal, and quiet. But Tomoe's early life was anything but conventional. We don't know her exact birth date, but she was likely born into a minor samurai family during the late Heian period. Some accounts suggest she may have been raised in the household of Minamoto no Yoshinaka himself. Whether she was his concubine, foster sister, or trusted retainer remains debated. But what's not debated is her skill. That didn't appear by accident. That was earned. While young boys were handed swords and drilled in the Bushido code, Tomoe would have had to prove, again and again, that she could do everything they could, and better. Her training would have been brutal. Swordsmanship wasn't just about strength, it was about timing, control, and reading your opponent. She would have trained in kenjutsu for blade work, and kyudo for archery, all while learning to fight in heavy armor and manage a warhorse in full gallop. In the rare moments of peace, she likely learned the nagintata, a curved blade polearm traditionally associated with female warriors. But make no mistake, this wasn't some symbolic ceremonial practice. This was preparation for real violence. Tomoe's fighting style combined elegance and lethality, and she didn't just keep up with the men, she often surpassed them. This phase of her life, before the battles, before the legends, was marked by isolation. Most women didn't carry swords. Most women didn't speak in strategy meetings. And most women weren't expected to live long on the battlefield. But Tomoe forced the world to bend around her. Every skill she learned had to be twice as sharp, twice as precise, and twice as deadly as her male counterparts. Because if she failed, no one would call it a soldier's mistake. They'd call it a woman's weakness. And so, before Tomoe Gozen could ever carve her name into the history books, she first had to carve her place into the samurai world, blade by blade, day by day, in silence and shadow. Not by invitation, but by sheer will. By the time Tomoe Gozen reached adulthood, Japan was on the brink of collapse. The Genpei War, a bitter civil conflict between the Taira and Minamoto clans, erupted in 1180. It wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a complete reshaping of the country's power structure. Emperors were being manipulated like chess pieces, and the warrior class was about to seize control of history. And Tomoe, she was right in the thick of it. Her lord and possible lover, Minamoto no Yoshinaka, was a distant cousin to the more famous Minamoto no Yoritomo. But unlike Yoritomo, Yoshinaka wasn't content with standing in the shadows. He wanted control over Kyoto, over the Minamoto clan, over the entire country. And when war broke out, he didn't hesitate. He raised his own army in the northern provinces and began his campaign southward, Right beside him, Tomo Gozen. She wasn't just a token warrior to show off in court. Tomo led troops into battle. She made strategic decisions. And when the fighting got bloody, she was at the front lines, blade drawn, giving orders most men wouldn't dare to question. She was a symbol of Yoshinaka's audacity, his willingness to defy tradition and win by any means necessary. The Genpei War was a savage affair. Battles were fought on rivers, in forests, through mountains. Arrows rained like monsoon storms, and hand-to-hand combat left the earth soaked in blood. One of Tomo's most famous victories came during the Battle of Yokotagawara, where she reportedly led a charge that decimated enemy forces. Chronicles claim she personally took the heads of several samurai and presented them as trophies. It wasn't for vanity, it was for proof. Every kill was a receipt, every head a message. But war wasn't just about glory, it was about loyalty and betrayal. As Yoshinaka gained power, tensions rose with Yoritomo, who saw his cousin's ambition as a threat. The Minamoto clan, already splintered by pride and ego, began to turn inward. While the Taira remained the enemy on paper, Yoshinaka now had to watch his back. Tomoe, ever loyal, stayed close. But even the strongest sword couldn't cut through politics. And as the war intensified, so did the pressure. Not just on Yoshinaka's claim to power, but on Tomoe's place in history. As the Genpei War dragged on, Yoshinaka's ambition outpaced his alliances. In 1183, after a series of brilliant military victories, he achieved what many thought impossible. He drove the Taira out of Kyoto and took control of the imperial court. At that moment, he was the most powerful man in Japan. And standing beside him, as always, was Tomoe Gozen, victorious, loyal, and bloodstained. But power is a double-edged blade. Yoshinaka had dreamed of restoring imperial authority, but the emperor and court nobles quickly realized he was as uncontrollable as the war he fought. He plundered the city, antagonized Kyoto's elite, and began making moves that alarmed even his fellow Minamoto. Most damning of all, he tried to take control of Emperor Go Shirakawa, a symbolic act of supreme authority that would doom him politically. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the de facto leader of the Minamoto faction, responded with swift condemnation. He declared Yoshinaka a traitor and dispatched two loyal generals, Minamoto no Noriyori and the famed Minamoto no Yoshitsune, to eliminate him. The Minamoto Civil War had begun, and Tomo Gozen was now fighting not against the Taira, but against her own clan. What followed was a rapid, tragic descent. Yoshinaka, once the bold and reckless upstart, found himself outmaneuvered and outnumbered. He retreated from Kyoto with only a handful of loyal retainers, including Tomoe. They made their final stand at the Battle of Owazu in early 1184. It would be a last gasp, not for glory, but for honor. As the enemy closed in, Tomoe fought like a demon unleashed. Chronicles say she charged into the enemy lines, found the strongest warrior she could, and promptly decapitated him before riding back through the carnage. It wasn't just skill, it was a message. Even in defeat, she wouldn't be erased. But Yoshinaka knew it was over. Legend holds that he asked Tomoe to leave the battlefield, not because he doubted her bravery, but because dying alongside a woman would be considered shameful for a samurai general. It was a cruel irony. The fiercest warrior at his side was being dismissed to protect his legacy. Did she obey? Some sources say yes. Others suggest she vanished into battle and was never seen again. Either way, the fall of Yoshinaka was the end of an era and the beginning of a myth. Snow blanketed the battlefield. It was February of 1184, and the plains of Owazu were quiet, too quiet for the bloody storm about to come. Minamoto no Yoshinaka stood with only a few dozen men left, once a conqueror of Kyoto, now a fugitive of his own clan. His final stand had come, and Tomoe Gozen, ever at his side, was not about to let him die alone. The odds were hopeless. Hundreds of enemy warriors, led by Yoshitsune and Noriyori, bore down on them. Their armour gleamed, their horses kicked up frozen earth. And amidst the frigid winds, Tomoe Gozen adjusted her helmet, drew her sword, and charged into legend. According to the 14th century Heike Monogatari, Tomoe did not retreat. She surged forward like a whirlwind, seeking the strongest opponent she could find. Hatakeyama Shigetada, a famed warrior in his own right. Whether out of fury, desperation, or a refusal to die quietly, Tomoe didn't wait for introductions. She locked blades, unseated him, and cut off his head in one fluid motion. One final trophy. This wasn't just showmanship. It was samurai ethos in motion. To die beautifully, to fight to the last breath, to prove oneself in the face of impossible odds. For Tomoe, it was also the moment that would define her for centuries. This singular act, recounted and reimagined by countless generations, became her battle cry echoing across time. Meanwhile, Yoshinaka's horse became stuck in a rice paddy, and a volley of arrows brought him down. His loyal companion Imai Kanehira committed suicide in dramatic fashion, placing his sword in his mouth and leaping from his horse. The warlord's inner circle had been extinguished. But Tomoe, here the records diverge. One version claims Yoshinaka ordered her to flee before his death, fearing the shame of dying alongside a woman. Others say she refused, fought her way out, and vanished into the mountains. Still others say she was captured, forced to marry an enemy general, and later became a nun. None of these endings have been confirmed. But one thing is certain. Her last recorded act at Owazu was not one of surrender. It was one of defiance. Tomoe Gozen didn't just disappear. She ascended into legend, carried on the back of one perfect, furious, final charge. After the blood-soaked snows of Owazu, Tomoe Gozen vanished from the official records, as if she rode straight off the battlefield and into myth. No historian can say with certainty what happened to her, and perhaps that's fitting. Warriors like Tomoe weren't supposed to survive. They were supposed to die with their lord, their sword, and their honour. But Tomoe? She may have chosen something far more rebellious: to live. The Heike Monogatari, our main source on Tomoe's life, offers conflicting stories. One claims she was captured and forced to marry one of Yoritomo's generals, Wada Yoshimori. She bore him a child, and after his death she became a nun, retreating from the world of steel and politics. Another tale claims she cut off her long warrior's hair, assumed a new identity, and vanished into the mountain monasteries of Nagano, never to be seen again. Yet another version hints that she continued to wander the countryside as a ronin, an unaligned warrior, hired for private vengeance and borderland skirmishes. And then, silence. Centuries of it. The truth, buried somewhere under folklore, scrolls and oral tales, may never surface. But Tomoe's vanishing act became part of her power. By slipping out of history, she became immortal. She was no longer constrained by one ending, one role, or one version of femininity. Instead, she became a symbol of possibility. What makes her story even more enigmatic is how Japan itself evolved in her absence. The rise of the shogunate under Minamoto no Yoritomo marked the beginning of the Kamakura period, a rigid, patriarchal era where women were pushed further into the background. Female warriors didn't vanish completely, but they were increasingly sidelined, romanticized, or erased. And yet, Tomoe endured, not in the dusty scrolls of official history perhaps, but in the stories mothers told their daughters, and soldiers whispered around campfires. She became a ghost that haunted the samurai ideal, the woman who fought like 10 men, but answered to no one. Over time, poets, playwrights, and artists resurrected her, sometimes as a tragic lover, sometimes as an avenging demon, sometimes as the last true samurai, but always, always as a figure who defied expectations and left a trail of mystery behind her. Tomoe Gozen didn't just vanish, she transformed, and the silence she left behind roars louder than any death scene. As centuries passed, The woman once feared on the battlefield became something else entirely, a legend moulded by poets, monks, and playwrights. In an era where women were expected to be invisible, Tomoe Gozen became unforgettable. The Heike Monogatari, a sweeping semi-historical war epic compiled in the 13th century, was the first to etch her into cultural memory. But this text was never just a history book. It was performance. It was theatre. Blind monks known as Biwa Hoshi travelled from town to town, chanting the stories of the Genpei War to the sound of the biwa lute. Through their voices, Tomoe Gozen was reborn, not just as a fighter, but as a tragic heroine. Later adaptations embellished her even further. In No and Kabuki theatre, Tomoe became a recurring figure. Her beauty exaggerated, her loyalty dramatized, her battles stylized to perfection. She was often paired with doomed love stories, tearful farewells, and moral lessons about honor and duty. The audiences didn't just watch her fight, they wept for her, admired her, and feared her in equal measure. But this romanticization came at a cost. The real woman, the one who decapitated enemies and led cavalry charges, was gradually softened. Over time, her armor was traded for flowing kimono. Her swordplay became metaphors for feminine resilience. She became palatable, noble, tamed, and yet her image refused to die. Artists throughout the Edo period painted her riding into battle, face calm, blade poised. Samurai guides included her in lists of martial paragons. Sword schools invoked her name. Even as her story was mythologized, it still carried the sharp edge of the battlefield. In modern Japan, Tomoe Gozen is often mentioned in the same breath as other legendary warriors, Musashi, Benkei, Yoshitsune. But unlike them, she carries the unique weight of gender defiance. She wasn't just an exception to the rule, she was a challenge to it. In every era since, women have looked to Tomoe as proof that their place is wherever they choose to stand, even if that's the heart of the battlefield. The further she drifted from fact, the closer she became to symbol. A woman who shouldn't have existed, yet did. A warrior who couldn't be contained, yet endured. And a story that refused to end. Tomoe Gozen's blade may have been sheathed over 800 years ago, but her presence lingers, etched not only in legend, but in the cultural psyche of Japan and beyond. As generations passed, she became more than just a figure from the Genpei War. She became a symbol of resistance, individuality, and the disruptive power of a woman who refuses to follow the script. During the Edo period, when samurai culture was formalized and ritualized into a strict code of conduct, Tomoe's image was used both as inspiration and caution. Some saw her as an embodiment of ideal loyalty, a warrior who served her lord to the bitter end. Others, especially in patriarchal scholarly circles, saw her as a dangerous anomaly, proof that when women step beyond their prescribed role, chaos follows. But even those who feared her couldn't erase her. By the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, when Japan sought to modernize and define its national identity, Tomoe re-emerged in textbooks and public discourse, this time as a patriotic heroine. She appeared in children's books, school plays, and nationalistic art, often alongside male samurai legends. While the portrayal was sanitized, the fact remained: a female warrior had made it into the canon. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Tomoe's legacy evolved once again. She became a favorite subject for manga artists, video game developers, feminist scholars, and filmmakers. In a media landscape full of cookie-cutter characters, Tomoe stood apart, a woman whose legend wasn't based on romance, but on combat. She wasn't the lover left behind. She was the one who picked up the sword and fought forward. Modern portrayals of Tomoe reflect shifting attitudes. Some cast her as a feminist icon, others as a tragic figure of unfulfilled destiny. Some present her as a warrior spirit haunting the battlefields. No matter the interpretation, she is always strong, always complex, and always just beyond the reach of complete understanding. Even in politics and education, Tomoe Gozen has become shorthand for defiance. Schools are named after her. Martial arts dojos cite her in their lineage. She appears on stamps, posters, and even anime storylines, her name invoked whenever someone needs to prove that a warrior's soul can come in any form. She may have fought one war, but her presence continues to rally people across every battle for identity, justice, and place. Tomoe Gozen never asked to be remembered. She didn't leave behind memoirs, letters, or poetic reflections. She left behind the only thing that truly mattered to a warrior of her age, a legacy forged in blood, loyalty, and fire. And in doing so, she achieved something few in history ever manage: immortality without asking for it. Unlike many women of her time, Tomoe wasn't preserved because she fit society's ideals. She was preserved because she broke them. Every time she swung her blade on a battlefield swarming with men who thought her unworthy, she rewrote the rules of feudal Japan. And though she vanished into obscurity, her absence only made her story louder. In a culture where silence often defined a woman's worth, Tomoe's silence after Owazu has become its own kind of roar. The absence of concrete facts surrounding her fate has given generations of artists, scholars, and revolutionaries permission to fill the void with meaning. She has become the embodiment of possibility, proof that one can defy the structure and still become legend. Her name lives on not just in literature and pop culture, but in the spirit of every woman who refuses to be invisible, every athlete who pushes beyond her limits, every leader who's told she's too bold, every fighter who doesn't wait for permission to stand her ground. Tomoe Gozen isn't just a historical figure. She's a standard bearer of defiance wrapped in silence. Today, statues of her stand in Nagano and across Japan. Schoolgirls study her in history classes. Cosplayers dress as her at anime conventions. Martial artists whisper her name as they train with the naginata. She even appears in international games and series, reminding global audiences that the archetype of the female warrior isn't fiction, it's history. And yet, her greatest power may lie in the fact that we still don't fully know her. Was she a concubine turned general? A foster daughter raised in the art of war? A lone ronin who walked into the mountains and never looked back? We may never uncover the full truth, but maybe that's the point. Tomoe Gozen was never meant to be one story. She was meant to be many, not bound by records nor erased by time, just eternally riding, sword drawn, into the legend she forged herself. Before satellites lit up the sky and compasses pointed north, ancient mariners stared out over endless horizons and asked the boldest question of all: what's out there? These weren't reckless fools. They were engineers, navigators, and dreamers. And with little more than the stars overhead and the winds in their sails, they carved sea routes that would become the first arteries of global connection. Humanity's relationship with the sea began tens of thousands of years ago. Some of the earliest evidence of watercraft dates back over 40,000 years, long before the agricultural revolution. Even then, early humans were already using rafts to reach distant islands like Australia, which required crossing hundreds of miles of open ocean. These were not lucky accidents. They were planned journeys, made with a clear understanding of tides, winds, and celestial patterns. By 3000 BCE, maritime technology was flourishing. Cultures in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and along the Nile were already using boats for trade and fishing. But it wasn't until certain cultures took to the high seas that true oceanic navigation began. These early seafarers faced enormous challenges: no maps, no written instructions, and often no guarantee they'd ever return. And yet, they went, driven by necessity, curiosity, and survival. They read the waves like a book. They observed how clouds formed over islands, how birds flew at certain times of day, and how the stars rotated across the sky. The night sky, in particular, became their greatest tool. Polaris, in the northern hemisphere, for instance, served as a fixed point for orientation. In the southern hemisphere, navigators watched the Southern Cross. these seafarers learned to feel the subtle push of currents beneath their hulls. They learned the sound of the wind in their sails, and most impressively, they passed this knowledge down orally for generations, through chants, stories, and sacred traditions. Their tools weren't compasses or astrolabes. Their tools were memory, observation, and intuition. This wasn't just survival, it was science before science had a name, a way of knowing the world that married nature and culture. And as they set out across unknown waters, these ancient mariners weren't just navigating oceans, they were laying the foundations for global trade, migration, and the first connections between civilizations that had never even heard each other's names. Long before the rise of Athens or the glory of Rome, the island of Crete was home to one of the most sophisticated seafaring civilizations the ancient world had ever seen, the Minoans. Flourishing from around 2000 to 1450 BCE, the Minoans weren't just islanders, they were maritime architects who turned the sea into a superhighway of culture, commerce, and control. At the heart of Minoan power was the city of Knossos, a sprawling palace complex adorned with vibrant frescoes of dolphins, ships, and sea life. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were declarations. The Minoans lived and breathed the sea. Their economy thrived on maritime trade, and their influence stretched across the Aegean, reaching Egypt, the Levant, and beyond. Unlike later Greek navies built for war, Minoan ships were designed for speed and stability, ideal for trade and diplomatic missions. Their vessels, often decorated with bird or bull motifs, used square sails and rowers to navigate the calm yet unpredictable Mediterranean. These ships carried everything from olive oil and wine to pottery and bronze. But more than goods, the Minoans carried ideas, art, religion, and technologies, dispersing them like waves across the Aegean. And how did they navigate? While there are no surviving Minoan navigational charts, archaeologists believe they relied on a combination of star-based navigation and visual markers, coastal headlands the colour of the water, bird flight paths. Their consistent returns from long journeys suggest a deep understanding of seasonal winds and maritime rhythms, long before anyone wrote them down. One of the most remarkable signs of Minoan maritime prowess is their role in the development of the Greek alphabet. By interacting with Near Eastern cultures like the Phoenicians, the Minoans helped pave the way for one of history's most influential scripts. Their ships weren't just ferrying cargo, they were floating vessels of cultural exchange. But like many sea-based powers, their end may have come from the very ocean they mastered. Around 1450 BCE, a volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, may have triggered tsunamis and ash clouds that devastated Minoan ports and destabilized their control. Whether by nature or invasion, their ships eventually disappeared from the waves. Still, the Minoans left behind more than ruins. They left behind a legacy of what it meant to rule not by land, but by sea. If the Minoans were the artists of the sea, then the Phoenicians were its tireless entrepreneurs. From around 1500 BCE to 300 BCE, the Phoenicians, a loose confederation of city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, dominated the eastern Mediterranean, not with armies, but with fleets. Their legacy isn't one of empires and conquests. It's one of navigation, trade, and the spread of culture across the known world. The Phoenicians didn't have a unified kingdom or grand capital. What they had were ships, and lots of them. These were sleek, fast, and highly maneuverable vessels capable of long-distance trade. Using both square sails and banks of oars, their ships could hug coastlines or dart across open water. And with them, they brought glass, cedar wood, purple dye, and most importantly, ideas. They were the middlemen of the ancient world, linking Egypt with Anatolia, Greece with Mesopotamia, and North Africa with the Western Mediterranean. They established outposts and colonies across the coastlines, most famously Carthage in North Africa, which would later rise to rival Rome. Each colony acted like a node in a vast maritime network, with the mother cities back east reaping the benefits of trans-Mediterranean commerce. But how did they manage to sail such distances with no compass or sextant? Like their Minoan predecessors, the Phoenicians used the stars, particularly Polaris, the North Star, as their guide. They also understood prevailing wind patterns, coastal features, and current behaviour. Many scholars credit them with developing one of the first systems of celestial navigation in the Western world. Yet their greatest contribution wasn't something they carried. It was something they invented: the alphabet. The Phoenician writing system, developed around 1050 BCE, was a revolutionary leap. An alphabet of just 22 characters, representing sounds rather than entire words or syllables. This script would go on to inspire the Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets. Through this linguistic breakthrough and their seafaring tenacity, the Phoenicians didn't just trade, they connected. They turned the sea from a barrier into a bridge, linking cultures, languages, and economies. And they did so not by colonizing hearts and minds, but by sailing from one to the next. The Mediterranean wasn't just their highway, it was their identity. While the Mediterranean world was abuzz with Phoenician traders and Greek triremes, an entirely different maritime saga was unfolding on the opposite side of the planet. One of outriggers, double-hulled canoes, and stars charted across the largest ocean on Earth. These were the Austronesian seafarers, and they didn't just sail the seas. They colonized half the planet's surface without metal tools, maps, or written language. Originating from what is now Taiwan around 3000 BCE, the Austronesians expanded steadily southward and eastward, hopping from island to island with astonishing speed. By 1500 BCE, they had reached the Philippines, Indonesia, and the edges of New Guinea. By 1000 BCE, they were in Micronesia and Melanesia. And by the first centuries, CE, they had reached as far as Madagascar to the west and Easter Island to the east, an arc of human migration that spans over 10,000 miles. Their vessels were marvels of engineering. Austronesians developed outrigger canoes for stability, and later, double-hulled voyaging canoes capable of carrying families, livestock, and cargo across thousands of miles of open ocean. They harnessed wind through crab-claw sails and used paddles for precision near islands. But what truly set them apart was their unparalleled skill in navigation. They used the sun, moon, planets, and more than 200 stars as guides. But that's just the beginning. Austronesian navigators, especially the famed Polynesian wayfinders, read the ocean like a living map. They could detect subtle changes in wave patterns caused by distant islands reflecting swells. They followed seabird flight paths, studied cloud formations, and even tasted seawater for salinity shifts near land. This wasn't instinct, it was highly refined science, passed down orally through chants and memory devices. Their migration wasn't random exploration. It was intentional and repeatable. Lapita pottery, a distinctive cultural artifact, marks their path across the Pacific, showing how interconnected their world truly was. They weren't just island hoppers. They were civilization builders, spreading agriculture, languages, and technology wherever they landed. And in many ways, they still are. Modern genetic studies, linguistics, and archaeology continue to uncover just how advanced and expansive Austronesian navigation was. These mariners didn't just cross oceans. They connected some of the most remote corners of the Earth long before European explorers ever left port. In the Pacific, the sea was never a void. It was a road map. When we think of ancient Egypt, towering pyramids and desert tombs usually come to mind. Not ships. But the Egyptians were no strangers to water. The Nile was their lifeline, their highway, and their first school of navigation. Yet what's often overlooked is how the Egyptians extended their maritime reach far beyond the riverbanks, venturing into the Red Sea and possibly even further afield. Egypt's mastery of the Nile began early. As far back as 3000 BCE, they built large wooden boats with planks lashed together by rope and sealed with resin. These vessels, propelled by both sails and oars, were essential for transporting goods, soldiers, and grain across the vast stretches of the river. But the Nile was only the beginning. By the time of Pharaoh Hatshepsut in the 15th century BCE, Egypt was launching sea expeditions from ports along the Red Sea. Her famous voyage to the mysterious land of Punt, possibly located in modern-day Somalia, Eritrea, or southern Arabia, was a landmark in ancient maritime history. Reliefs from her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari show detailed depictions of large cargo ships loaded with exotic animals, incense trees, and gold, all returning from a successful voyage across the sea. These weren't accidental drifts. They were carefully organised missions, planned with knowledge of monsoon wind patterns, currents, and seasonal timing. Egyptian sailors would have hugged coastlines, used star patterns for navigation, and relied on maritime scouts, perhaps even recruiting skilled local sailors from the Red Sea region. Some theories even suggest Egyptian contact with the Indus Valley via indirect maritime trade, especially during the peak of Mesopotamian Indus-Egyptian interaction. While direct evidence is limited, items such as ivory, lapis lazuli, and spices hint at a broader Indian Ocean trade network in which Egypt may have played a part. The ships themselves were engineering marvels for their time. Built from imported cedarwood, mostly from Lebanon, Egyptian seafaring vessels featured curved hulls and large square sails. These ships could carry heavy loads and withstand the swells of the Red Sea. Though the Egyptians never became a dominant naval power like the Phoenicians, they left an important legacy. They were among the first to treat maritime voyages as royal, sacred, and strategic endeavours. Their sea journeys were extensions of their empire, diplomacy, and divine authority. On land, they built pyramids, but on water, they launched ambition. Amid the dusty plains of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, once thrived one of the world's oldest urban civilizations, the Harappans, or the Indus Valley Civilization. Flourishing between 2600 and 1900 BCE, they built cities with advanced sanitation, standardized bricks, and remarkable urban planning. But buried beneath this archaeological brilliance is another truth, one less spoken but deeply significant. The Harappans were maritime traders. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left behind no deciphered writing, no grand naval reliefs, and no epic tales of sea voyages. Yet clues of their maritime prowess quietly dot the archaeological record. Excavations at Lothal, a major Harappan port city in Gujarat, revealed what many believe is one of the world's earliest known dockyards. Measuring 218 metres long with floodgates and channels, it connected to an ancient river that flowed to the Arabian Sea, proof that Harappan engineers weren't just thinking inland, but outward. Artifacts tell the rest of the story. Harappan seals and goods, beads, ivory, ceramics, have been found in Mesopotamia, specifically in the Sumerian cities of and Lagash. Akkadian texts refer to a distant land called Meluha, likely the Indus region, from which boats arrived bearing exotic goods. In return, the Harappans received silver, tin, and lapis lazuli, suggesting a complex trade network stretching from the Persian Gulf to the broader Near East. But how did they sail? While no complete Harappan ships survive, miniature models, terracotta boats, and carved depictions suggest the use of flat-bottomed rivercraft and seagoing vessels. They likely used the same seasonal monsoon winds that would later drive Arabian and Indian traders across the Indian Ocean. Harappan mariners probably hugged coastlines, stopping at natural harbours and estuaries, and navigated using celestial cues and current patterns. Unlike the warrior-focused empires of their time, the Harappans were remarkably peaceful. Their cities show little evidence of warfare or fortifications. This makes their maritime connections even more intriguing. They weren't conquering foreign shores. They were connecting them through trade and diplomacy. And then, around 1900 BCE, the civilization began to decline. Rivers shifted, trade dwindled, and cities were abandoned. Their script faded with them, leaving behind a silent question. Just how far did their ships sail? Though their voices are lost, the water trails remain, etched in harbours, seals, and silent stones. For the ancient Greeks, the sea wasn't just a pathway, it was destiny. Cradled by the Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas, Greek civilization emerged in a world where sailing was as essential as farming. From the age of Homeric epics to the height of Athenian naval dominance, the Greeks turned maritime culture into art, science, and strategy. Their earliest stories, those of Odysseus battling sea monsters and Jason chasing the Golden Fleece, weren't mere myths. They were reflections of a people intimately tied to the sea. Greek city-states like Athens, Corinth, and Rhodes all relied on the ocean not just for trade, but for identity. Their gods had dominion over waves. Their heroes set sail. Their empires floated on hulls of wood and ambition. By the 8th century BCE, Greek colonists were setting out across the Mediterranean, founding cities from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. These colonies weren't military outposts. They were trade hubs, cultural satellites, and vital ports in a vast economic web. Goods flowed both ways: olive oil, wine, and pottery from Greece, grain, metals, and slaves from afar. To navigate, Greek sailors relied heavily on coastal sightlines, the stars, especially the rising and setting of specific constellations, and oral navigation knowledge passed through generations. Their ships evolved from simple merchant vessels to formidable war machines like the trireme, a sleek, three-tiered galley rowed by up to 170 men and armed with a bronze battering ram. The trireme was more than a ship. It was a floating expression of Athenian democracy and power. At its peak in the 5th century BCE, Athens boasted the most powerful navy in the ancient world. The Delian League, originally a defensive alliance against Persia, became an Athenian-led maritime empire. Their navy ensured control over sea lanes, tributes from allied cities, and the free flow of resources into Athens, feeding its golden age of philosophy, architecture, and drama. But with power came vulnerability. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta saw Athens' over-reliance on sea dominance backfire. Naval defeats, blockades, and internal strife brought about its downfall. Still, the legacy endured. Greek maritime innovations in cartography, celestial navigation, and shipbuilding laid the groundwork for Roman and later European seafaring. And their belief that the sea was a stage for glory, knowledge, and tragedy echoes in Western thought even today. For a people who started as landlocked farmers and shepherds, the Romans were late to embrace the sea. But once they did, they didn't just join the naval powers of the ancient world, they crushed them. The Mediterranean, once a patchwork of rival fleets and scattered colonies, became what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Early Rome was no maritime superpower. The Etruscans and Greeks dominated Italy's coasts, while Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers, ruled the western Mediterranean with the most formidable navy in the region. But everything changed during the Punic Wars. Faced with Carthage's naval superiority, the Romans made a bold move. They reverse-engineered a captured Carthaginian warship. In an astonishing feat of industrial determination, they built an entire fleet, hundreds of ships, in mere months. But they added something uniquely Roman: the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned sea battles into land combat. This innovation played to Rome's strength in infantry, allowing legionaries to storm enemy ships as if they were charging a fortress. Victory over Carthage in the Punic Wars handed Rome not only naval dominance, but also control over Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and eventually the entire Mediterranean coastline. Roman galleys, both military and merchant, patrolled sea lanes, transporting grain, troops, and exotic goods from Egypt, Gaul, Syria, and beyond. Ports like Ostia and Alexandria bustled with activity, turning the Mediterranean into a Roman highway. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace lasting 2 centuries, was made possible largely through this maritime control. The sea, once a place of pirate fleets and clashing empires, became a stabilized zone of commerce. Grain shipments fed the capital. Luxury goods, silk, spices, pearls, flowed in from India and China via maritime routes, stretching to the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Roman sailors used a combination of dead reckoning, coastal sailing, and celestial navigation. aided by detailed maritime itineraries known as periploi. Though lacking compasses, they mastered the rhythms of wind and current, especially the Etesian winds that made return voyages in the eastern Mediterranean predictable. Rome didn't just conquer by land, it sustained itself by sea. Its navy protected trade, enforced imperial will, and ensured communication across vast distances. With their fleets, the Romans did what no other culture had yet managed. They turned the chaotic sea into a controlled empire. Long before modern maps, compasses, and diesel engines, the ancient world was already connected by an invisible latticework of sea routes, drawn not with ink, but with wind, memory, and stars. From the reed boats of the Nile to the double-hulled canoes of the Pacific, these early maritime cultures didn't just explore the seas, they defined them. And their legacy still lingers in every port, every trade route, and every ship that crosses the waves today. The knowledge passed down by Minoans, Phoenicians, Austronesians, Egyptians, and others became the bedrock of future navigation. These cultures discovered how to read the sky like a map, how to sail with the rhythms of the earth, and how to build ships that could survive months at sea, all without metal hulls or written charts. Their discoveries weren't isolated, they were cumulative. Each seafaring civilization learned from its predecessors or neighbours, contributing a new stitch in the tapestry of global navigation. Phoenician alphabets enabled the record-keeping necessary for complex maritime trade. Austronesian navigation traditions, preserved orally for generations, inspired 20th century efforts to revive wayfinding without instruments. Greek observations of the stars and winds laid the groundwork for ancient geography. Roman engineering gave us ports and lighthouses still echoed in today's harbour design. Even more significant than the tools were the connections. Maritime routes allowed ideas to travel faster than armies. Religions spread by sea. So did technology, crops, language, and diseases. The maritime cultures of the ancient world didn't just move objects, they moved civilizations. Without them, the ancient Silk Roads would have stopped at the shoreline. Without them, empires might never have risen, and distant peoples might have remained strangers forever. And yet, for all their accomplishments, so many of these early sailors remain nameless. Their stories were rarely written down. Their ships decayed and vanished. What survives are fragments, pottery shards in a sunken cargo hold, a port structure buried beneath modern concrete, a star map etched on bone or bark. But their impact, that still moves with the tide. Every container ship crossing the Suez Canal, every satellite-guided cargo run across the Pacific, every naval patrol in the Mediterranean, owes something to those first brave souls who dared to chase the horizon. They may have been ancient, but they were never primitive. They were the original navigators of the human story. In the ancient world, royal birth was a blessing wrapped in a curse. The instant a child was born into a palace, they became more than a person. They became a symbol, a political weapon, and the future of an empire. Their education didn't begin in a classroom. It began in the nursery, surrounded by whispers of lineage, legacy, and looming threats. Unlike common children, who learned survival through labour, elite children were groomed for leadership from the start. Every gesture they made, every word they spoke, was watched, corrected, and crafted. Their lives were performances in training, rehearsals for thrones they had not yet earned. They didn't learn to read for leisure. They learned so they could read treaties. They didn't learn to speak to express themselves. They learned to command obedience, recite laws, and deliver carefully calculated flattery to foreign envoys. The content of their education depended heavily on geography and dynasty, but the goals were universal: control, charisma, and continuity. A Babylonian prince might be drilled in cuneiform by scribes, while an Egyptian heir would be introduced to priestly hieroglyphs, rituals, and sacred myths. In Greece, philosophy was essential. In Persia, etiquette was military. In China, Confucianism ruled the curriculum. Even their toys were political. Miniature weapons, board games simulating strategy, and symbolic animals reflected the roles they were expected to master. Tutors weren't just teachers, they were handlers. Carefully chosen by the court, they were loyal, elite, and often expendable. If the royal child failed, it was the tutor who paid the price. The stakes were always high. A poorly educated heir was a national liability. A soft or ill-prepared child could become a pawn in the hands of enemies or ambitious relatives. Education, then, wasn't about personal development. It was about regime survival. But for all its strictness, royal education could also be dazzling. These children were exposed to astronomy, medicine, foreign languages, ethics, and art long before the rest of the world. Some of them became polymaths, statesmen, generals, and scholars, raised not just to rule, but to outshine every mind in the room. To be born royal in the ancient world wasn't just to be born lucky, it was to be born into a lifelong test, and education was the first battlefield. Behind every powerful ruler in the ancient world was often a far more obscure figure, the tutor. These weren't just glorified babysitters. They were philosophers, priests, generals, and political operatives. Their task? To shape a child not just into an adult, but into a ruler, a diplomat, and sometimes a god. Few tutor-student pairings have echoed louder through history than that of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. Chosen by Philip of Macedon, Aristotle was tasked with turning the headstrong prince into something more than just a warrior. He taught him ethics, rhetoric, zoology, geography, and philosophy, and infused him with an insatiable hunger for knowledge. When Alexander later conquered the known world, he carried copies of Homer and philosophical texts with him like sacred weapons. Aristotle hadn't just taught him facts. He had crafted the inner world of a future conqueror. But Aristotle was no exception. In the Roman Empire, Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and statesman, was assigned to tutor the young Nero. He tried to shape the boy with virtue, logic, and restraint. Unfortunately, history tells us that Nero grew into one of Rome's most infamous tyrants. The failure wasn't entirely Seneca's, but it showed how even the best teachers couldn't always overcome a student's darker instincts or courtly influence. In Persia, royal tutors were often military men, chosen for their loyalty and their ability to instill discipline. Princes of the Achaemenid dynasty were taught hunting, horseback riding, and combat from the age of 7, alongside moral training in truthfulness and justice, all under the watchful eyes of elite mentors. Their education was practical, Spartan, and deeply political. In ancient China, Confucian scholars held enormous sway over the upbringing of princes. They instilled ideals of filial piety, hierarchy, and ritual. But woe to the tutor who taught the wrong thing. A slip of the tongue could lead to banishment or death if a lesson contradicted the emperor's doctrine. Being a royal tutor meant living in the shadows, shaping history through someone else's mouth and hand. They had to be wise, but invisible, commanding yet deferential. They walked a dangerous line. Get too close, and they were envied. Fail, and they were discarded. Succeed, and their names lived on only if their students made history. While the sons and daughters of farmers learned from life, elite children of the ancient world learned from systems built behind palace walls, private academies, temple libraries, and in some cases, secret priestly schools that protected knowledge like it was gold. Education for royals wasn't just about preparing for power, it was about controlling the flow of knowledge, the one thing more dangerous than armies. In ancient Egypt, priesthoods were the gatekeepers of education. Royal children, especially future pharaohs, were sometimes educated in temple schools, where instruction included reading hieroglyphs, memorizing religious texts, understanding ritual practice, and learning astronomy and medicine. These were not skills shared with the general public. Literacy was rare, sacred, and only those destined to govern or interpret the divine were granted access. Much of this training was conducted in what we might call secret schools. Within temples like those at Karnak or Heliopolis, knowledge was transmitted from priest to pupil in complete confidentiality. The curriculum wasn't just religious, it was political. Knowing how to recite spells, interpret omens or plan rituals gave rulers control over life and death in the eyes of their people. Persia had its own elite educational structure. The sons of Persian nobility, especially those close to the king, were educated in what Herodotus called the king's school. Hidden from public view, these boys learned truth-telling, riding, archery, and leadership. They also absorbed Zoroastrian ethics and statecraft. This schooling wasn't just for princes. It was for future satraps, generals, and administrators. Men expected to control provinces and armies with unwavering loyalty. In India, royal children might attend gurukulas, secluded forest schools run by learned Brahmins. While commoners rarely had access, princes were often placed under the guidance of a single guru who taught them everything from Vedic hymns to martial skills. The education was holistic, spiritual, intellectual, and physical, and again, deeply hierarchical. Knowledge was tailored to caste, role, and destiny. Even in Greece, where education was more democratized in some cities, elite children like those in Sparta or Athens received specialized training. Spartan royal sons were placed in the agog, the state-run military academy. Athenian aristocrats hired private tutors in logic, strategy, and rhetoric, because knowing how to win a war was only half the battle. Knowing how to win an argument could be even more important. In all these worlds, knowledge wasn't merely taught. It was guarded, passed like a sword, meant only for those who could wield it. In the ancient world, royal women were rarely expected to lead armies or govern states, but that didn't mean their education was trivial. In fact, for many dynasties, the instruction of elite daughters was just as calculated and strategic as that of their brothers. Because royal women weren't only daughters, they were future queens, priestesses, political pawns, and sometimes power players. In Egypt, royal women could hold immense influence. Queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti didn't merely stand beside pharaohs. They ruled, built temples, and engaged in diplomacy. This required education. Princesses in Egypt were often taught by temple priests in reading hieroglyphs, reciting religious texts, managing estates, and performing sacred rituals. Those destined to become God's wives of Amun were initiated into priestly orders, learning rites and theology far beyond the reach of commoners. Some even participated in governance with knowledge that rivaled their male counterparts. In Persia, royal women were kept behind palace curtains, but they weren't idle. The Achaemenid queens were entrusted with managing vast estates, overseeing treasuries, and maintaining courtly alliances. To do so, they were taught bookkeeping, diplomacy, and political etiquette. Greek historians like Xenophon note how Persian queens engaged in behind-the-scenes governance, indicating a quiet but formidable education. In ancient Greece, the story is mixed. In Athens, education for women, even elite ones, was minimal and domestic. Music, weaving, household management, and some reading. But in Sparta, royal women were raised for strength. They trained in physical fitness, rhetoric, and Spartan values. A Spartan princess could speak her mind and command estates while her husband waged war. And when Spartan men died young in battle, it was often the women who upheld the legacy. In India and China, noble women's education reflected religious and dynastic priorities. In the Gupta Empire, royal daughters were sometimes schooled in Sanskrit, music, poetry, and philosophy, skills designed to enhance their allure and status. In imperial China, empresses and consorts were taught Confucian ethics, calligraphy, and palace protocol. Those destined for political roles, like Empress Lu Ji or Wu Zetian, went far beyond, mastering governance, surveillance, and statecraft under the guise of etiquette. Royal women walked a delicate path. They were expected to charm, not rule, but when circumstances changed, they often stepped into power. And when they did, their education wasn't a frill. It was their arsenal. If swords won battles, Speech won empires. In the ancient world, a royal's ability to speak wasn't a soft skill. It was a weapon. Language, rhetoric, and public persuasion were essential tools of rule, diplomacy, and survival. And so, elite children weren't merely taught to speak. They were trained to captivate, manipulate, and command through words. Nowhere was this clearer than in ancient Greece, where rhetoric was seen as the hallmark of a civilized leader. Athenian aristocrats learned from masters like Isocrates and later the Sophists, who taught persuasive speech as both an art and a science. Young elites practiced delivering speeches, debating in public forums, and mastering logos, pathos, and ethos, the pillars of classical persuasion. For those raised to govern, a sharp tongue could be more useful than a sharp blade. This ideal spread across cultures. In Rome, elite boys were taught oratory from a young age. They memorized Cicero's speeches, learned courtroom strategy, and practiced delivering arguments while maintaining poise and decorum. For imperial heirs, this wasn't just about courtly performance, it was about survival. A poorly timed phrase could invite scandal. A brilliant speech could sway the Senate. Even in monarchies where absolute power reigned, words still mattered. In Egypt, the pharaoh was seen as a divine speaker. His proclamations carried ritual and legal weight. Royal children learned formal language and ceremonial formulas, reciting them during religious processions and state rituals. In Mesopotamia, scribal schools taught elite children not only how to write, but how to write persuasively, crafting royal decrees, diplomatic letters, and mythic hymns. In Persia and India, language played a different but equally vital role. Persian princes were trained in multiple tongues, Old Persian for court, Aramaic for diplomacy, and sometimes Greek or Median. They learned how to negotiate, compliment, and intimidate with tone and timing. Indian royal students, especially under the Maurya and Gupta empires, studied Sanskrit epics and philosophical texts like the Arthashastra, which offered tactical lessons in rhetoric, espionage, and diplomacy. Even in cultures where oral tradition reigned, like among Celtic and Germanic elites, storytelling and speech-making were forms of authority. A prince who couldn't speak well couldn't lead. Because in the end, power wasn't just taken, it was spoken into existence. For ancient royals, the sky was not just a canvas of stars. It was a calendar, a compass, a clock, and sometimes a divine script. And beneath that sky, the numbers mattered. Mathematics and astronomy weren't optional subjects for royal heirs. They were foundational disciplines that shaped how a ruler understood time, taxes, architecture, war, and even fate itself. In Mesopotamia, long before Pythagoras was a household name, Babylonian elites were studying base 60 math systems, predicting eclipses, and calculating planetary movements with astonishing precision. Royal scribes and priest astronomers were often tutors to princes, teaching them to read cuneiform tablets filled with data on stars, weather, and omens. These calculations weren't abstract. They had real consequences for when to wage war, plant crops, or perform royal rituals. Egyptian royal education also wove mathematics into nearly every sphere of power. Pharaohs needed to understand land measurement for taxation after Nile floods. They also had to oversee monumental building projects, temples, tombs, and pyramids, requiring geometric knowledge and logistical skill. Astronomy guided Egypt's religious calendar, and royal children were taught to track the heliacal rising of Sirius, which heralded the annual inundation and marked the start of the year. In ancient India, members of the royal class were exposed to the deep mathematical traditions found in texts like the Sulba Sutras, and later, Aryabhata's work on algebra and planetary motion. Astronomy was both scientific and spiritual, essential for aligning rituals and interpreting omens. A wise king consulted the stars, but an educated one could interpret them himself. The Greeks refined these teachings, making them more systematic and philosophical. A Macedonian prince like Alexander would study arithmetic and astronomy, alongside ethics and logic. Greek royal education, influenced by thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, treated mathematics as a gateway to understanding the order of the cosmos, and by extension, one's place as a ruler within it. Even the Chinese imperial courts relied heavily on astronomy. Emperors were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and the ability to predict celestial events validated their divine right to rule. Court astronomers were powerful figures, and princes were educated in lunar cycles, eclipse prediction, and calendar reform. In every culture, the educated ruler didn't just rule over people, they ruled over time, space, and destiny. And math and the stars were their silent advisors. Books could crown a ruler, but swords kept them on the throne. For ancient royalty, education didn't end in the classroom. It extended to the battlefield, where courage, physical mastery, and strategic skill were as vital as philosophy or statecraft. Elite children, especially male heirs, were raised with one unspoken truth: if you cannot defend your kingdom, someone else will take it. In Sparta, this belief was law. Royal sons entered the Agog, the state's brutal military academy, by age 7. There, they were stripped of comfort and trained in pain tolerance, endurance, hand-to-hand combat, and battlefield tactics. Even princes were not spared. They fought, bled, and survived alongside other Spartan boys, forging a bond through hardship that would serve them on the front lines. In Persia, royal boys were educated in the 3 R's of nobility: riding, archery, and truth-telling. Horsemanship was essential, not only for war, but also for royal hunting expeditions, which doubled as strategic drills. Archery was more than a skill. It was a symbol of discipline, focus, and martial prowess. A Persian prince who couldn't handle a bow was unfit to rule. India's warrior classes, such as the Kshatriyas, were trained from a young age in Dhanurveda, the martial science. Royal children learned to wield swords, spears, maces, and bows. They also studied the philosophies of war through epics like the Mahabharata, which taught not just how to fight, but why to fight, and what honour required in the face of death. Egyptian and Mesopotamian princes were also expected to be commanders. They practiced chariot driving, spear throwing, and wrestling under the guidance of military officers. Pharaohs were often depicted smiting enemies, but that theatrical image was grounded in real training. War wasn't theoretical. Rulers led from the front. In Rome, the young patrician elite were taught both virtues, manly courage, and disciplina. They trained with wooden swords, learned formations, and read military histories. Julius Caesar wasn't just a scholar, he was a hardened general, trained to balance pen and sword from youth. Even Chinese princes, often more insulated by bureaucracy, practiced martial arts, archery, and horseback riding as part of their princely curriculum. The ruler was expected to embody both the civil and the military ideal, the Wen and the Wu. In every empire, education in warfare wasn't optional. It was survival. For a royal child, a misplaced word could start a war. A glance held too long could spark a scandal. In ancient courts, knowing how to sit, speak, and smile was as much a weapon as wielding a sword. Etiquette wasn't fluff, it was strategy. Behind every bow and banquet was a game of survival, and royal education drilled this into the heirs of empires. From China to Persia, court etiquette was codified to a level of near paralysis. In Han China, princes were expected to memorize and observe the Li, ritual codes dictating everything from how to greet a superior to how to mourn properly. A single breach of protocol could be interpreted as rebellion. Young royals were taught to move with precision, to speak with restraint, and to read the power dynamics in every room. In Persia, royal children were schooled in the art of courtly appearance. This included not just dress and manners, but also how to handle envoys, deflect insults, and respond with poise under pressure. They were trained in indirect communication, mastering the political doublespeak necessary to survive in a palace filled with spies and sycophants. In India, Natishastra, the science of politics and ethics, was a key part of elite education. Texts like the Arthashastra outlined how a king must navigate betrayal, use informants, and maintain a balance between diplomacy and force. Royal heirs were expected to understand these concepts early, because one wrong alliance or naive gesture could cost them their throne or their life. The Greeks and Romans, too, took court behaviour seriously. Athenian elites were schooled in charis, personal charm and grace, while Roman boys learned the art of flattery, public conduct and surveillance. Julius Caesar wasn't just trained to fight, he was taught how to win over senators, undermine rivals, and read a man's ambition by his tone. In Egypt, etiquette blurred with divinity. The pharaoh wasn't just royalty, he was a god. Royal children were taught to behave with serene dignity at all times, their bodies seen as symbols of cosmic order. Even their posture mattered. Their stillness wasn't passivity, it was power in silence. And always, beneath the manners and rituals, lay espionage. Tutors often taught princes how to test loyalty, gather secrets, and spot deception. Because in every palace, someone was always watching, and survival depended on watching back. A royal education was never just about shaping a child, it was about shaping the future of a dynasty. For ancient elites, every lesson in logic, battle, etiquette, and language carried the weight of generations. A well-educated ruler could unite kingdoms, stabilize empires, and earn immortality in marble and myth. A poorly prepared one could unravel everything. In many ways, royal education was the empire's gamble on itself. Every coin minted, every scroll copied, every tutor hired was an investment in a single person's ability to hold the realm together. And the pressure on that child, whether prince, princess, or pawn, was immense. Take Alexander the Great. His conquest of half the known world wasn't just fueled by ambition or cavalry tactics. It was rooted in years of tailored instruction under Aristotle, who instilled in him a thirst for knowledge, debate, and divine destiny. Alexander didn't merely conquer, he carried with him Greek culture, science, and diplomacy, becoming a symbol of Hellenistic unification. Contrast that with Nero, who was also rigorously trained by none other than the Stoic philosopher Seneca. He had every educational advantage Rome could offer, yet still descended into cruelty, paranoia, and excess. His failure wasn't just personal. It cast a shadow over the Roman imperial image, igniting revolts and tarnishing Rome's authority for years. Education, it turned out, was not a guarantee. It was a crucible. For royal women, the stakes were no less grave. A queen consort could become regent, a princess could be married off as a peace offering, or rise to rule in her own right. The education of figures like Cleopatra or Wu Zetian wasn't a luxury, it was preparation for empire. Their ability to speak multiple languages, manage treasuries, and navigate deadly court politics kept them alive, and in power. Even long after their deaths, the impact of these royal educations endured. Many rulers became patrons of learning, founding academies, libraries, and temples of knowledge. Their own childhood instruction became the model for future generations, repeated, refined, and ritualized. In the end, the education of the royal child was never just about the child. It was about legacy, about ensuring the past didn't die, and that the future could be ruled with wisdom, not just force. Because in the ancient world, the throne was inherited, but the ability to keep it, that had to be taught.